"Hold on a minute, Bud," Kate objected. "Maybe she was asleep, and probably from the sound of it because she was so worn out from doing everything for you." "Maybe so," Bud said with a grin. "But remember, whether she actually was asleep is less important right now than whether I was thinking she was asleep. We're talking now about my perception once I betrayed myself. That's the point." "I know," Kate said, settling back into her chair. "I'm just having fun. If it were my example, you'd have plenty to pile on about." "So from the perspective of that moment," Bud continued, looking at me, "if she was just feigning sleep and letting her child wail, what kind of mom do you suppose I thought she was being?" "Probably a pretty lousy one," I said. "And what kind of a wife?" "Again, pretty lousy, inconsiderate, thinks you don't do enough, and so on." He wrote both of these on the diagram. "So here I am," he said, backing away from the diagram and reading what he had written. "Having betrayed myself, we can imagine that I might have started to see my wife in that moment as lazy, inconsiderate, taking me for granted, insensitive, a faker, a lousy mom, and a lousy wife." "Wow, Bud, congratulations," said Kate sarcastically. "You've managed to completely vilify one of the best people I know." "I know, it's scary, isn't it?" "I'll say." "But it's worse than that even," Bud said. "That's how I started to see Nancy. But having betrayed myself, how do you suppose I started to see myself?" "Oh, you probably saw yourself as the victim, as the poor guy who couldn't get the sleep he needed," Kate replied. "That's right," Bud said, adding victim to the diagram. "And you would have seen yourself as hard-working," I added. "The work you had to do the next morning probably seemed pretty important to you." "Good, Tom, that's right," Bud said, adding hard-working and important. "How about this?" he asked after a pause. "What if I'd gotten up the night before? How do you suppose I would have seen myself if that had been the case?" "Oh, as fair?" Kate answered. "Yes, and how about this?" he added. "Who is sensitive enough to hear the child?" I had to laugh. All of this, the way Bud saw Nancy and the way he saw himself, seemed on one hand so absurd and laughable, but on the other hand so common. "Well, you were the sensitive one, obviously," I said. "And if I'm sensitive to my child, then what kind of a dad do you think I am?" "A good one," Kate answered. "Yes, and if I'm seeing myself as all of these," he said, pointing to the board, "if I see myself as hard-working, fair, sensitive, a good dad, and so on, then what kind of a husband do you think I am?" "A really good husband, especially putting up with a wife like the one you were thinking you had," Kate said. "Yes," Bud said, adding to the list, "so look what we have." He went back to the diagram, and under self-betrayal, he drew a large box. He divided the box in two and wrote, "How I started to see myself," on one side, and "How I started to see Nancy," on the other. Under How I Started to See Myself, he wrote, "Victim, hard-working, important, fair, sensitive, good dad, and good husband." Under How I Started to See Nancy, he wrote, "Lazy, inconsiderate, unappreciative, insensitive, faker, lousy mom, and lousy wife." Let's think about this diagram. For starters, look how I started to see Nancy after I betrayed myself. As lazy, inconsiderate, and so on. Now think of this. Do these thoughts and feelings about Nancy invite me to reconsider my decision and do what I felt I should do for her? Not at all, I said. What do they do for me? Bud asked. Well, they justify your not doing it. They give you reasons to stay in bed and not to tend to David. That's right, Bud said, turning to the board. He added a second sentence to his description of self-betrayal. Self-betrayal. Number 1. An act contrary to what I feel I should do for another is called an act of self-betrayal. Number 2. When I betray myself, I begin to see the world in a way that justifies my self-betrayal. If I betray myself, Bud said as he backed away from the board, my thoughts and feelings will begin to tell me that I'm justified in whatever I'm doing or failing to do. He sat back down, and I thought of Laura. For a few minutes, he said, I want to examine how my thoughts and feelings do that. Chapter 12. Characteristics of self-betrayal. To begin with, think about this. When did Nancy seem worse to me? Before I betrayed myself or afterward? Afterward, for sure, I said, his question pulling me back to his story. Yes, said Bud. And when do you suppose sleep seemed more important to me? Before I betrayed myself or after? Oh, I guess after. And when do you suppose other interests, like my work responsibilities the next morning, for example, seemed more pressing to me? Before I betrayed myself or after? Again, after. Bud paused for a moment. Now here's another question. Take a look again at how I started to see Nancy. Do you suppose that in reality she's as bad as she seemed to me after I betrayed myself? No, probably not, I said. I can vouch for Nancy, said Kate. The woman described up there bears no resemblance. That's true, Bud agreed. Yeah, but what if she did? I interjected. I mean, what if she really was a lazy and inconsiderate person, and even a bad wife, for that matter? Wouldn't that make a difference? It's a good question, Tom, Bud said, rising again from his chair. Let's think about that for a minute. He started to pace the length of the table. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Nancy is lazy. And let's assume that she is generally inconsiderate, too. Some people are, after all. Here's the question. If she was lazy and inconsiderate after I betrayed myself, then she must have been lazy and inconsiderate before, right? Yes, I answered. If she's lazy and inconsiderate, she's lazy and inconsiderate. Before, after, it wouldn't matter. Okay, good, said Bud. But if that's the case, then notice. I felt I should get up and help her, even though she was lazy and inconsiderate. Before I betrayed myself, I didn't see her faults as reason not to help her. I felt that way only after I betrayed myself, when I used her faults as justification for my own misbehavior. Does that make sense? I wasn't sure. It seemed like it probably made sense, but the discussion made me uncomfortable because I had an example of this situation in my own house. Laura was inconsiderate, although perhaps not lazy, and it sure seemed to me that she was a pretty lousy wife. At least she had been recently, and it seemed like that was relevant to whether or not she deserved help from me. It was hard to want to help someone who showed no feelings for me. I guess that makes sense, I said, still troubled and unsure about how and whether to express my concerns. Here's another way to think of it, Bud said, sensing my uncertainty. Remember what we were just talking about. Even if Nancy really is lazy and inconsiderate, when do you suppose she would have seemed more lazy and inconsiderate to me? Before I betrayed myself or after? Oh, yeah, I said, remembering the earlier point. After. That's right. So even if she is lazy and inconsiderate, the truth is that in self-betrayal, I'm making her out to be more lazy and inconsiderate than she really is. And that's something I'm doing, not something she's doing. Okay, I get that, I said, nodding. So, think about it, Bud continued. Here I am in self-betrayal, and I think that I'm not getting up to help Nancy because of what she's doing to me, because she's lazy, inconsiderate, and so on. But is that the truth? I looked at the diagram. No, I said, beginning to see the picture. You think that's the truth, but it's not. That's right. The truth is, her faults seemed relevant to whether I should help her only after I failed to help her. I focused on and inflated her faults when I needed to feel justified for mine. After I betrayed myself, the truth was just the opposite of what I thought it was. Yeah, I guess that's right, I said, nodding my head slowly. This was getting pretty interesting, but I was still wondering how Laura fit into it. That's how Bud's view of Nancy was distorted, Kate added. But consider how his view, even of himself, became distorted. Do you suppose that he's really as hard-working, important, fair, and sensitive as he was claiming himself to be? He was experiencing himself as a good dad and husband, for example. But in that moment, was he in actual fact being a good dad and husband? No, that's right, he wasn't, I said. At the same time that he was inflating Nancy's faults, he was also minimizing his own. He was inflating his own virtue. Yes, said Kate. So think about it, Bud said, jumping back into the conversation. Was I seeing myself clearly after I betrayed myself? No. How about Nancy? Was I seeing her clearly after I betrayed myself? No, you weren't seeing anything very clearly, I said. So once I betrayed myself, my view of reality became distorted, Bud said in summary, turning toward the board. He added a third line to the description of self-betrayal. Self-betrayal. 1. An act contrary to what I feel I should do for another is called an act of self-betrayal. 2. When I betray myself, I begin to see the world in a way that justifies my self-betrayal. 3. When I see the world in a self-justifying way, my view of reality becomes distorted. So, Tom, Bud said after we'd paused to read what he had written, where was I after I betrayed myself? Where were you? I asked, trying to figure out the question. Think about it, he replied. Before I betrayed myself, I simply saw something I could do to help Nancy. She was a person with a need that I felt I should fill. I saw the situation straightforwardly. But after I betrayed myself, my view both of her and myself became distorted. I saw the world in a way that justified my failure. My perception became distorted systematically in my favor. When I betrayed myself, I became self-deceived. Oh, I see it, I said enthusiastically. So when you betrayed yourself, you entered the box. That's what you mean. That's the answer to your question of where you were, isn't it? Exactly, he said, turning again and writing on the board. Self-betrayal is how we enter the box. Self-betrayal. 1. An act contrary to what I feel I should do for another is called an act of self-betrayal. 2. When I betray myself, I begin to see the world in a way that justifies my self-betrayal. 3. When I see the world in a self-justifying way, my view of reality becomes distorted. 4. So, when I betray myself, I enter the box. Based on this discussion, I think we should add a few summary elements to your diagram, Bud, Kate said as she got up and walked toward the board. Sure, go ahead, he said, taking his seat. First, she drew a box around the description of Bud's experience after he betrayed himself. Then, to the side, she wrote, When I betray myself, I enter the box. I become self-deceived. Now, she said, turning to me, I want to pull together and summarize from Bud's story 4 key characteristics of self-betrayal. And as I do it, I'm going to list them right here on this diagram. First of all, she said, remember how after Bud betrayed himself, he made Nancy worse than she was? Yeah, I nodded. He inflated her faults. exactly. Kate added, inflate others' faults to the diagram. And what about Bud's own faults? She said. Did he see them straightforwardly after he betrayed himself? No, I answered. He sort of ignored his own faults and just focused on Nancy's. That's right. She added, inflate own virtue to the diagram. And do you remember what happened to the perceived importance of things, such as sleep and fairness, after Bud betrayed himself? She asked. Yes, they seemed more important after he betrayed himself than they did before. That's right. After Bud betrayed himself, the perceived importance of anything in the situation that could provide justification for his self-betrayal became inflated, like, for example, the importance of sleep, fairness, and his responsibilities the next day. Kate added, inflate the value of things that justify my self-betrayal to the diagram. Okay, she said, one more, and then I'll sit down. When in this story did Bud start to blame Nancy? I looked at the diagram. When he betrayed himself, I answered. That's right. He wasn't blaming her when he just felt he should help her, only after he failed to help her. She added blame to the diagram. After I betrayed myself, Bud said, consider how blame-filled my entire experience became. Those things on the diagram are thoughts I had about Nancy. But consider what happened to my feelings toward her after I got in the box. For example, do you suppose I might have felt irritated? Absolutely, I said. But notice, Bud said, drawing my attention to the diagram. Did I feel irritated toward her when I just felt I should help? No. And how about anger? Do you suppose I felt angry after I got in the box? Oh, yeah. Just look at the way you were seeing her. If my wife seemed that way, I'd be pretty mad at her. I was jolted by my own comment, because as I looked at the diagram, my wife did seem that way to me. You're right, Bud agreed. I think I was pretty upset at what I viewed to be my wife's insensitivity to my situation. So my blaming didn't stop with my thoughts. In the box, my feelings were blaming too. They said, I'm irritated because you're irritating, and I'm angry because you've done things to make me angry. In the box, my whole way was blaming. Both my thoughts and my feelings told me Nancy was at fault. And just to be clear here, he continued, was Nancy to blame? Was I irritated and angry because of Nancy, like my irritation and anger were telling me? Were my thoughts and feelings telling me the truth? I thought for a moment. I wasn't sure. It seemed strange that feelings could lie, if that was what Bud was suggesting. Think about it this way, Bud went on, pointing to the board. What's the only thing that happened in this story between the time that I wasn't irritated and angry and the time I was? I looked at the diagram. Your choice not to do what you felt you should do, I said. Your self-betrayal. That's right. That's all that happened. So what caused my irritation and anger at Nancy? Your self-betrayal, I said, my voice trailing off as I became lost in the implications of this thought. Really? Is that right? I looked again at the diagram. Bud walked back to the board, and next to the existing box he wrote, When I betray myself, I enter the box. I become self-deceived. Under that he listed the ways that self-deception is manifest. Inflate others' faults. Inflate own virtue. Inflate the value of things that justify my self-betrayal. And blame. Before he betrayed himself, Bud saw Nancy, whatever her faults, simply as a person who could use his help. I understood that. But after he betrayed himself, she seemed very different to him. She didn't seem to deserve help anymore. And Bud thought that he felt that way because of how she was being. But that wasn't true. The only thing that happened between the time that Bud felt irritated and angry and the time he didn't was something that Bud did, his own self-betrayal, not seeing something that Nancy did. So Bud's feelings were lying to him. But that can't be my case, I screamed in my mind. Laura really is a problem. I'm not just imagining it. And heaven knows I'm not making it up. I mean, there's no tenderness or caring in her at all. She's like a cool steel blade. And I know the pain of that blade. She uses it with skill. And Bud's telling me that it's my fault? What about Laura? Why isn't it her fault? That thought caught me. That's right, I told myself. Maybe it is her fault. Maybe she's the one who's betraying herself. I started to feel better. But wait, I argued with myself. I'm blaming. That thought itself is a blaming. And blaming is something that Bud started doing after he betrayed himself, not before. Yeah, but so what? I fired back at myself. If Laura's the one wielding the blade, I'm justified in blaming. But why do I need to feel justified? Oh, blast it, why am I questioning myself? I thought. Laura's the one with the problem. But that's what Bud thought too, I recalled. I felt trapped between what I thought I knew and what I was learning. Either the stuff was all wet or I was. I was a mass of confusion. Then I saw a way out. Chapter 13. Life in the Box. I looked up at the board again. Yes, I cheered silently. All of this trouble happened because Bud betrayed a feeling that he had for Nancy. But I rarely have those kinds of feelings for Laura. And the reason why is obvious. Laura is so much worse than Nancy. No one would feel they should do things for her given the way she is. My case is different. Bud got into trouble because he betrayed himself. I am not betraying myself. I sat back, satisfied. Okay, I think I get this, I said, preparing to ask my question. I think I understand the idea of self-betrayal. Check me on it. As people, we have a sense of what other people might need and how we can help them, right? Yes, Bud and Kate said almost in unison. And if I have that sort of sense and go against it, then I betray my own sense of what I should do for someone. That's what we call self-betrayal, right? That's right, yes. And if I betray myself, then I start seeing things differently. My view of others, myself, my circumstances, everything is distorted in a way that makes me feel okay about what I'm doing. Yes, that's right, Bud said. You begin to see the world in a way that makes you feel justified in your self-betrayal. Okay, I said. I understand that. And that's what you call the box. I go into the box when I betray myself. Yes. Okay. But here's my question. What if I don't have a feeling that I betray? For example, what if when a kid cries, I don't have a feeling of sense like the one you had? What if I just elbow my wife and tell her to get the kid? What you're saying is that that's not self-betrayal and that I wouldn't be in the box, right? Bud paused for a moment. That's an important question, Tom. We need to think about it with some care. As for whether or not you'd be in the box, I wouldn't know. You'll have to think of situations in your life and decide for yourself. But there's something we haven't talked about yet that may help you with your question. So far, we've learned how we get in the box. At this point, we're ready to consider how we carry boxes with us. How we carry them with us? I asked. Yes. Bud stood up and pointed at the diagram. Notice that after I betrayed myself, I saw myself in certain self-justifying ways. For example, as hard-working, important, fair, sensitive, and the sort of person who's a good dad and good husband. That's how I saw myself after I betrayed myself. But there's an important question. Was I lying there thinking of myself in these self-justifying ways before I betrayed myself? I thought about the question. No, I wouldn't think so. That's right. These self-justifying ways of seeing myself arose in my self-betrayal, when I needed to be justified. Okay, that makes sense, I said. But think about it, Bud continued. The story of self-betrayal we've been talking about is just one simple example, and it happened many years ago. Do you think it's the only time I've ever betrayed myself? I doubt it, I said. You can do more than doubt it, Bud said, chuckling. I don't think I've ever gone a day without betraying myself in some way, and perhaps not even an hour. I've spent a lifetime betraying myself, as have you, Kate, and everyone else at Zagram. And every time I've betrayed myself, I've seen myself in certain self-justifying ways, just like I did in the story we've been talking about. The result is that over time, certain of these self-justifying images become characteristic of me. They're the form my boxes take as I carry them with me into new situations. At this, Bud added a fifth sentence to the list about self-betrayal. Self-betrayal. 1. An act contrary to what I feel I should do for another is called an act of self-betrayal. 2. When I betray myself, I begin to see the world in a way that justifies my self-betrayal. 3. When I see the world in a self-justifying way, my view of reality becomes distorted. 4. So, when I betray myself, I enter the box. And 5. Over time, certain boxes become characteristic of me, and I carry them with me. I sat there trying to digest the meaning of all this, but I wasn't quite sure I understood. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take this self-justifying image right here, Bud said, pointing to good husband on the diagram. Let's imagine that over many self-betrayals, this self-justifying image has become characteristic of me. So as I move through my marriage and my life, I see myself as the sort of person who's a good husband. Fair enough? I nodded. Now consider this. It's Mother's Day, and near the end of the day, my wife says in a hurt voice, I don't think you thought about me much today. Bud paused, and I thought about Mother's Day at my own house a few months earlier. Laura had said almost the same thing. If I'm carrying a self-justifying image that says I'm the sort of person who's a good husband, how do you suppose I might start to see Nancy when she accuses me of not thinking about her? Do you suppose I might start to feel defensive and blame her? Oh, absolutely, I said, thinking of Laura. You'd blame her for failing to notice or give you credit for all the things you do, for example. Yes, so I might blame her for being ungrateful. Or for even more than that, I added. You might feel trapped by her. I mean, there she is accusing you of being uncaring when she's the one who hardly ever cares for you. It's hard to throw yourself into making her day wonderful when she herself never does anything that would make you want to do that in the first place. I stopped short as I felt the cool wind of embarrassment against my soul. Bud's story had transported me to my own troubles, and my indiscretion had given Bud and Kate a peek at the raw emotion I felt toward Laura. I cursed myself and resolved to stay more detached. That's right, Bud said. I know exactly what you mean. And when I'm feeling that way toward Nancy, do you suppose I might also inflate her faults? Might she seem worse to me than she really is? I didn't want to answer, but Bud waited. Yeah, I suppose so, I said flatly. And notice something else, Bud continued. As long as I'm feeling that way, will I ever seriously consider Nancy's complaint? That I hadn't really thought of her? Or will I be more likely to brush it off? I thought of an endless string of altercations with Laura. You probably wouldn't question yourself much, I said finally, without much enthusiasm. Here I am, Bud continued, pointing to the board, blaming Nancy, inflating her faults, and minimizing my own. So where am I? I guess you're in the box, I answered half-audibly, while my mind argued the point. But what about Nancy? Maybe she's in the box too. Why don't we consider that? I suddenly started to feel very angry with this, all of it. Yes, I heard Bud say. But notice, did I have to have a feeling that I betrayed in that moment in order to be in the box toward her? The question didn't quite register. What was that? I asked belligerently. The edge in my voice caught me by surprise, and I felt exposed once again. My resolution of detachment had held for all of 1 minute. I'm sorry, Bud, I said, trying to recover. I didn't quite catch the question. Bud looked at me gently. It was clear that he'd noticed my anger, but he didn't seem put off by it. My question was this. Here I was in the box toward Nancy. I was blaming her, inflating her faults, and so on. But did I have to have a sense that I betrayed in that moment in order to be in the box toward her? For some reason, this brief exchange and the focus required by Bud's question calmed me. I thought about his story. I couldn't remember him mentioning a sense that he betrayed. I'm not sure, I answered. I guess not. That's right. I didn't have to have a feeling that I betrayed in that moment in order to be in the box, because I was already in the box. I must have looked a bit puzzled because Kate jumped in with an explanation. Remember what Bud was just talking about, Tom? Over time, as we betray ourselves, we come to see ourselves in various self-justifying ways. We end up carrying these self-justifying images with us into new situations, and to the extent that we do, we enter new situations already in the box. We don't see people straightforwardly, as people. Rather, we see them in terms of the self-justifying images we've created. If people act in ways that challenge the claim made by a self-justifying image, we see them as threats. If they reinforce the claim made by a self-justifying image, we see them as allies. If they fail to matter to a self-justifying image, we see them as unimportant. Whichever way we see them, they're just objects to us. We're already in the box. That's Bud's point. Exactly, Bud agreed. And if I'm already in the box towards someone, I generally won't have feelings to do things for them. So the fact that I have few senses to help someone probably isn't evidence that I'm out of the box. It may rather be a sign that I'm deep within it. So you're saying that if I generally don't have feelings to do things for someone in my life, say for my wife Laura, I'm probably in the box toward that person? Is that what you're saying? I asked. No, not exactly, answered Bud as he took his seat. I'm suggesting that's the way it generally is for me, at least for those I'm closest to in my life. Whether it's the same with you, toward Laura, for example, I don't know. You'll have to wrestle with that for yourself. But as a general rule, let me suggest this. If you seem to be in the box in a given situation, but can't identify a sense you betrayed in that moment, that's a clue that you might already be in the box. And you may find it useful to wonder whether you're carrying around some justifying images that are feeling threatened. Like being the sort of person who's a good partner, for example? I asked. Yes, or the sort of person who's important or competent or hard-working or the smartest, or being the sort of person who knows everything or doesn't make mistakes or thinks of others and so on. Almost anything can be perverted into a self-justifying image. What do you mean by perverted? I mean that many self-justifying images are the in-the-box perversions of what would be great out of the box. For example, it's great to be a good partner. That's exactly what we should be for our partners. And it's great to think of others and to try to be as knowledgeable as we can be in whatever areas we work in, and so on. But these are the very things we're not being when we have self-justifying images about them. I'm not sure I understand, I said. Well, Bud said, standing again, let's think about self-justifying images for a minute. He resumed his pacing. For example, certainly it's good to think of others. But who am I thinking of when I'm thinking of myself as the sort of person who thinks of others? Yourself, I guess. Exactly. So my self-justifying image lies to me. It tells me I'm focusing on one thing, in this case, others, but in having that image, I'm actually focused on myself. Okay, fair enough, I said, looking for holes in his logic. But what about the one you mentioned about being smart or knowing everything? What's the problem with that? Well, let's think about it. Let's say you have a self-justifying image that says you know everything. How do you suppose you'd feel toward someone who suggested something new to you? I might find something wrong with his suggestion. Right. So would he keep coming to you with new ideas? Probably not. And would you end up learning new things? No, I guess not. Oh, I see your point, I said suddenly. My self-justifying image about being learned can be the very thing that sometimes keeps me from learning. Yes, so if I have that self-justifying image, is knowing everything really what I'm most concerned about? Not really. I guess your major concern is yourself, how you look. Exactly, Bud said. That's the nature of most self-justifying images. Bud continued, but I was no longer paying attention. I became lost in my own thoughts. Okay, so I can carry my boxes with me. Maybe I have some of these self-justifying images that Bud's talking about. Maybe I'm in the box toward Laura. Maybe Laura is just an object to me generally. Okay. But what about Laura? All of this seems to be saying that I'm the one with the problem. But what about her problem? What about her self-justifying images? Let's talk about that. My anger was building again when all of a sudden I became aware of it. Then of something more. I was aware of the hypocrisy in my anger. For here I was, angry that Laura was in the box. But in my anger at her being in the box, I was in the box. I was angry for her being like I was being. The thought caught me short, and Laura seemed different to me in an instant. Not different in the sense that she no longer had problems, but different in the sense that I saw myself as having problems too. Her problems no longer seemed to excuse mine. Kate's voice intruded on my thoughts. Tom? Yeah. Is all this making sense, Tom? I think I understand it, yeah, I said slowly. I don't necessarily like it, but I understand it. I paused, still thinking of Laura. I think I have some work to do. It was an interesting moment. For the first time that afternoon, I was fully open to what Bud and Kate were sharing with me, open to the possibility that I had a problem. More than open, actually, I knew I had a problem, and in some ways a big one. Until that moment, I'd felt that giving in to the possibility that I had a problem would mean that I was the loser, that I'd been wrestled to the ground, that Laura had won. But now, it didn't seem that way at all. I felt in a strange way free and unencumbered. Laura didn't win and I didn't lose. The world seemed much different from what it was the moment before. I felt hope. Amazingly, I felt hope in the moment I discovered I had a problem. I know what you mean, said Kate. I have a lot of work to do myself. Me too, Bud said, nodding. A moment or two passed in silence. We have one more thing to talk about, Bud said. And then I want to turn our discussion back to business and see what all this means for Zagrum. Chapter 14. Collusion. So far, Bud said, We've been examining the internal experience of someone who's in the box. But as you can imagine, my box can have quite an impact on others. Think about it, he said, walking to the board. Suppose this is me, in my box, he said, drawing a box with a stick figure in it. If I'm here in my box, what am I communicating to others? What are you communicating? Yes. Well, you're blaming them, I guess. Exactly. And do you suppose other people are generally walking around saying to themselves, "Gee, I really feel blameworthy today. I need someone to blame me." I laughed. Yeah, right. I don't think so either, Bud said. Most people are generally walking around thinking something like, "Look, I'm not perfect, but doggone it, I'm doing just about as well as you could expect under the circumstances." And since most of us have self-justifying images we're carrying around with us, most people are already in a defensive posture, already ready to defend their self-justifying images against attack. So if I'm in the box, blaming others, my blame invites them to do what? I guess your blame would invite them to be in the box. That's right, he said, drawing a second person in the box. By blaming, I invite others to get in the box, and then they blame me for blaming them unjustly. But because I feel justified in blaming them while I'm in the box, I feel that their blame is unjust and blame them even more. Of course, while they're in the box, they feel justified in blaming me and feel that my further blame is unjust. So they blame me even more, and so on. So by being in the box, I invite others to be in the box in response, he said, adding arrows pointing in both directions between the boxes. And others, by being in the box in response, invite me to stay in the box. Then Bud added a sixth sentence to the principles he was writing about self-betrayal. Self-betrayal. 1. An act contrary to what I feel I should do for another is called an act of self-betrayal. 2. When I betray myself, I begin to see the world in a way that justifies my self-betrayal. 3. When I see the world in a self-justifying way, my view of reality becomes distorted. 4. So, when I betray myself, I enter the box. 5. Over time, certain boxes become characteristic of me, and I carry them with me. And 6. By being in the box, I provoke others to be in the box. You can put any flesh on these bones you'd like, Kate said, pointing to the diagram. And you'll see that when someone's in the box, the same pattern of mutual provocation and justification always emerges. Let me give you an example. I have an 18-year-old son named Brian, and to be frank, he's been a struggle. One of the things that really bugs me is that he frequently gets home late. I'd been so caught up in thinking about Laura that I'd nearly forgotten my troubles with Todd. The mere thought of him now in response to Kate's comment about her boy darkened my mood. Now imagine that I'm in the box toward Brian. If I am, how do you suppose I'd likely see him and his getting home late? Well, I said, you'd see him as irresponsible. Okay, good, said Kate. How else? You'd think he's a troublemaker. And disrespectful, added Bud. Yes, agreed Kate. Then pointing to the board, she asked, Is it okay if I erase this blame diagram, Bud? Sure. Bud sat down and Kate walked to the board. She drew a summary of what we'd said. Okay, she said, putting some finishing touches on the drawing. So here we have it. At the top of the board were written the names of Kate on one side and Brian on the other. On Brian's side of the board were the words, What he does. Under this heading, Kate had written the words, Gets home late. Kate had drawn an arrow from what he does to a box under Kate's side of the diagram. In the box she wrote, What I see. Irresponsible, troublemaker, disrespectful. Let's think about this situation. If I'm in the box and see Brian as an irresponsible and disrespectful troublemaker, what sorts of things do you suppose I might do?" "Well," I began. "You'd probably discipline him pretty severely," Bud interjected. I nodded and added, "And you might start criticizing him a lot." "Okay, good," Kate said, adding to the drawing. "Anything else?" "You'd probably start hovering over his shoulder to make sure he was staying out of trouble," I said. She added that to the drawing and stepped to the side. "Now let's suppose Brian betrays himself and that he's in the box toward me. If he's in the box toward me, how do you suppose he might see me in my disciplining, criticizing, and hovering over his shoulder?" "He'd probably see you as dictatorial," I said, "or maybe unloving." "And nosy," Bud added. "Okay, dictatorial, unloving, and nosy," she repeated as she added to the drawing. "Good," she said. "Now look what we have." There was now a "What I Do" headline in Kate's box. Under this headline were listed the words "discipline harshly," "criticize," and "hover over shoulder." There was an arrow pointing from Kate's "What I Do" list to Brian's box where Kate had written "What He Sees." Under the heading "What He Sees" in Brian's box were listed the words dictatorial, unloving, and nosy. If Brian's in the box and seeing me as an unloving, nosy dictator, do you suppose he'll want to come home earlier or later? "Oh, later," I said. "Far later." "In fact," Bud offered, "he'd be less likely to do anything the way you'd like him to do it." "Yes," Kate agreed, drawing another arrow from Brian's box to her own. "So around and around we go," she said, adding still more arrows between the boxes. "Think of it. We provoke each other to do more of what we say we don't like about the other." "Yeah, think about it, Tom," said Bud. "If you were to ask Kate in this situation what she wanted more than anything else in the whole world, what do you suppose she'd tell you?" "That she wanted Brian to be more responsible, less trouble, and so on?" "Precisely. But what's the effect of what Kate does in the box? Does she invite more of what she says she wants?" I looked at the diagram. "No, in fact, it looks like she invites more of what she says she doesn't want." "That's right," Bud agreed. "She invites Brian to do more of the very behavior that she says she hates." This comment got me thinking about Todd, who frequently did things I didn't want him to do. I looked at the diagram again. On the one hand, Kate's role in this seemed crazy, as it looked like she was actually inciting more of the very behavior that she was complaining about. But on the other hand, what was she supposed to do? Just let her son get home late? "But isn't Kate just doing what any parent would do in this situation?" I asked. "Sometimes you have to correct or punish children to get them to do what they need to do, don't you?" "And do you suppose my being in the box invited Brian to get home earlier?" Kate responded. "Well, no," I said, "but—" "Criticism is hard enough to receive, even from someone who's out of the box, isn't it?" Kate interjected. "But from someone who's in the box, what are the chances of receiving that well?" "I see. Probably not too good." "And when do you think my discipline would be more appropriate to the circumstance, and therefore more effective?" she asked. "When I'm in the box, inflating others' faults, or when I'm out of the box and seeing them clearly?" I nodded. "When you're out." "So you see, Tom, from within the box I end up undermining the effectiveness of everything I do, even if discipline in this case, for example, is exactly what Brian needs. My box makes it nearly certain that I won't be able to invite in Brian the changes I would like to see in him. And the problem isn't merely that the box makes me ineffective, it's that it makes me destructive. From within the box, I end up inviting more of the very thing I'm complaining about, as well as other behaviors, as Bud pointed out, that I will hate just as much, if not more." "But that's crazy," I said, after a moment's reflection. Why would you, or anyone else for that matter, ever do that? Why would we keep such a destructive cycle going?" Kate paused for a moment, apparently collecting her thoughts. "I believe the answer to that, Tom, is that my box needs for it to continue." "What?" I said reflexively. The answer didn't make any sense to me. Kate smiled. "I know it sounds absurd, doesn't it? Who would ever get themselves into a position where they actively invite others to continue treating them poorly, even miserably? Who would do that?" "Exactly," I echoed. "Who would do that?" "And the answer, Tom, is that I would, and you would, and Bud would, and everyone else here at Zagram would. Whenever we're in the box, we have a need that is met by others' poor behavior. And so our boxes encourage more poor behavior in others, even if that behavior makes our lives more difficult." "How? Why?" I asked. "Let me answer those questions by telling you something that happened about a year ago in this situation with Brian. On a particular Friday night, Brian asked if he could use the car. I didn't want him to use it, so I gave him an unreasonably early curfew time as a condition, a time I didn't think he could accept. "Okay, you can use it," I said smugly, "but only if you're back by 10:30. "Okay, Mom," he said as he whisked the keys off the key rack. "Sure." The door banged behind him. I plopped myself down on the couch, feeling very burdened and vowing that I'd never let him use the car again. The whole evening went that way. The more I thought about it, the madder I got at my irresponsible kid. I remember watching the 10 o'clock news, stewing over Brian the whole time. My husband Steve was home too. We were both complaining about Brian when we heard the squeal of tires in the driveway. I looked at my watch. It was 10:29. And you know what? I was all ears. In that moment, when I saw the time, I felt a keen pang of disappointment. "Now think about that for a minute," she continued after a short pause. "That night, I would have told you that the thing I wanted most was for Brian to be responsible, to keep his word, to be trustworthy. But when he actually was responsible, when he did what he said he'd do, when he proved himself trustworthy, was I happy?" "No." I shook my head in wonder at the thought. "You probably still would have been irritated, huh? You might even have gotten after him for squealing the tires." "I'm ashamed to admit that I did something just as perverse," Kate replied. "After he came in the door, having made it on time, mind you, rather than thanking him or congratulating him or acknowledging him, I welcomed him with a curt, 'You sure cut it close, didn't you?'" Kate sat down. "Notice, even when he was responsible, I couldn't let him be responsible." She paused. "I still needed him to be wrong." I fidgeted as I thought of my own son. "I would have told you at the time that I wanted a responsible son. But is that really what I wanted most, Tom?" she asked. I shook my head. "It doesn't sound like it." "That's right," she said. "When I'm in the box, there's something I need more than what I think I want most. And what do you think that is? What do you think I need most when I'm in the box?" I repeated the question to myself. What do I need most when I'm in the box? What do I need? I wasn't sure. Kate leaned toward me. "What I need most when I'm in the box is to feel justified. Justification is what my box eats, if it were, in order to survive. And if I'd spent my whole night, and really a lot longer even than that, blaming my son, what did I need from my son in order to feel justified, to feel right?" "You needed him to be wrong," I said slowly, a knot forming in my stomach. "In order to be justified in blaming him, you needed him to be blameworthy." In that moment I was transported back some 16 years. I was handed a little bundle by the nurse, and from that bundle 2 cloudy eyes looked up toward my face. I was completely unprepared for what he would look like at birth. Bruised, misshapen, and grayish. He was a funny-looking kid, and I was his daddy. I'd been blaming Todd almost from that day. He was never smart enough, never coordinated enough, and he was always in the way. Since he'd started school, he'd been in constant trouble. I didn't remember ever feeling proud when anyone realized he was my son. He'd never been good enough. Kate's story scared me to death. I asked myself, what must it be like to be the son of someone for whom you can never be good enough? And if Kate's right, then there's a sense in which I can't let him be good enough. I need him to be a problem in order to feel justified in always seeing him as a problem. I felt sick, and I tried to push Todd out of my mind. It's exactly right, I heard Kate say. Having spent the evening accusing Brian of being a disappointment, I needed him to be a disappointment, so that I would be justified in accusing him. We sat for a moment in thought. Finally, Bud broke the silence. Kate's story raises for me an astonishing point, Tom. And that is, when I'm in the box, I need people to cause trouble for me. I actually need problems. As incredible as that sounded, it rang true. Bud rose from his chair. Remember when you asked me this morning whether you can actually run a business being out of the box all the time? You said it seemed like you'd get run over if you were out of the box all the time, seeing people as people. Yeah, I remember. And then we talked about how that question is misguided, because you can do almost any behavior, soft, hard, whatever, either in the box or out of the box. Do you remember? Yes. Well, now we can say more about your question. It's an important question. Let's consider it in the light of what Kate has just taught us. Think of it this way. Who needs to be run over? The person who is in the box or the person who is out? The person in the box, I said, amazed by the implication. That's right. Out of the box, I get no mileage whatsoever in being run over. I don't need it. And what's more, I'm usually not doing anyone a favor by letting them run over me. In the box, on the other hand, I get what I most need when I'm run over. I get my justification. I get my proof that the person running over me is just as bad as I've been accusing him or her of being. But in the box, you don't really want to be run over, do you? I asked. I mean, that's kind of strange. Kate's story got me thinking about my son, Todd. Laura and I feel like we get run over sometimes, but I don't think either of us really wants that. That's true, Bud responded. We're not saying that in the box we enjoy problems. Far from it. We hate them. In the box, it seems like there's nothing we would want more than to be out from under them. But remember, when we're in the box, we're self-deceived. We're blind to the truth about others and ourselves. And one of the things we're blind to is how the box itself undercuts our every effort to obtain the outcomes we think we want. Bud walked over to the board. Think about Kate's story again for a moment. He pointed at the diagram. Notice how her blaming from within the box provokes Brian to be irresponsible. And then, when he is responsible, she takes that as justification for having blamed him in the first place for being irresponsible. Likewise, Brian's blaming provokes Kate to be on his case, and then when she is on his case, he takes that as justification for having blamed her in the first place for being on his case. By the simple fact of being in the box, each helps to create the very problems he or she blames the other for. In fact, Tom, Kate added, Brian and I provided each other with such perfect justification, it's almost as if we colluded to do so. It's just as if we said to each other, look, I'll mistreat you so that you can blame your bad behavior on me if you'll mistreat me so that I can blame my bad behavior on you. Of course, we didn't ever say that to each other or even think it, for that matter. But our mutual provocation and justification seem so perfectly coordinated, it looks like we did. For this reason, when two or more people are in their boxes towards each other, mutually betraying themselves, we often call it collusion. And when we're in collusion, we actually collude in condemning ourselves to ongoing mutual mistreatment. And we do this, Bud jumped back in, not because we like being mistreated, but because we're in the box, and the box lives on the